Alright, so we're finally switching up the books a little bit. The first few we've done for this series have been in Night Shift, and now we're going to switch over to Everything's Eventual, and actually the first story in Everything's Eventual, which was covered in the Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries, which is now the second episode of this series that we're talking about, despite the fact that we haven't talked about the book Nightmares and Dreamscapes yet. But, this is King tackling a territory that is so well known that he actually mentions it in the... I keep wanting to say epilogue, it's not even... it's like after the epilogue, where he actually speaks to us as Stephen King, and the first thing he says is, at some point I think every writer of scary stories has to tackle the subject of premature burial, if only because it seems such a pervasive fear. And yeah, he mentions frequently throughout the story the episode called Breakdown, I think, Alfred Hitchcock Presents with Joseph Cotton, where he was in a similar scenario, and we kind of get beaten over the head with that in the episode because it's on the TV in the background during the scenes with him and his fiancée, the flashbacks. But to their credit, they never draw attention to it or what it is. So I do like that they kind of threw that in. You could tell the people that adapted it into the episode really took every possible detail they could out of the short story. For the most part, they added a few things, and I don't know if those totally work, but this was definitely going to be a concept of what is the execution is going to make or break this. Absolutely. So when you look at some of the stuff we've seen before, like the Joseph Cotton episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but there's also a Tales from the Crypt episode that's probably one of the best episodes of that series, which is called Abracadaver, and it has Beau Bridges and Tony Goldwyn. Also went into this in kind of a really cool and sadistic way. But here we have Richard Thomas, who is not a stranger to King territory. Of course, he played Bill, adult Bill, in the It miniseries. And I do love... it was a brilliant call to start off this episode the way that they did, where it works for each medium, because in the book it starts with him already in the body bag and in the hospital, wherever he is, and it's him kind of trying to figure out where he is or how he got to this point, and the way we're just kind of thrown into it, and how he kind of suddenly awakens once he's at the hospital. And that really works for the book. That is such a great start to the story. And the episode, we actually get the point of view shot of him laying on the golf course looking into the sun, and then we see him zipped up. And then we kind of get our little opening title sequence as he's trying to figure out how he got into this body bag. And I love that opening shot, seeing him actually zipped up, I think absolutely works perfectly for the series. And I don't know that they would have worked as well if you were to like try to reverse them or try to do one opening with the other. So that's a really great start. But then, of course, since he's locked into his own body, a lot of Richard Thomas's performance is going to be through narration. And there are a number of ways to do this, because we've also had, if not necessarily about this topic, we've had a lot of, like, even feature-length movies set mostly, if not entirely, through a first-person perspective. The trouble is in those scenarios, the person is always moving, at least. And it's like, would we be able to do this with the person being in one place the whole time? Because when I first thought about this story being translated to screen, especially as just a 45-minute, episode of a series, I kind of got it in my head. It was like, is it going to be entirely from his perspective looking up at the doctors? And just his narration's going to guide us through it. And it's like, that sounds like super, super risky, and like it may not have been a good idea or wouldn't have been a good way to translate it. But I feel like if a talented enough person tried, it could have been pulled off. But they didn't go that route. So in the meantime, we have... and I almost think it would be a bit more sensible to only have him narrate when we're looking out through his eyes. But the trouble is after the opening scenes, we don't really get too many of the point of view shots. It's all it's just filmed in a normal way like any other episode would be, and we're just hearing the narration based on what he's hearing them say. And like his body can be entirely off screen and the doctors are doing something else and we can still hear him narrating. And I get it, like as it goes on you tend to get why they would need to do that. But I still feel like they could have done something a bit more creative with this, because there's a reason this one was chosen out of the 8 stories they used to put into this. And I know it can definitely be argued that many of the 8 that they chose for this series, they probably could have found more enticing ones or more, creative ones to use, but I don't know. But I do think in some cases it works, but most of what we're looking at here is the flashbacks. Because if it was that case of the whole thing is through his perspective, I could see the flashbacks would work in that sense. Because when you think of a concept that's like this, that feels... obviously we talk about the ways we've seen it before, but it's still unique enough that we really want to see this concept in play. I would say that flashbacks were a bad idea. And it was kind of like they'd be a cop-out in many scenarios like this, as they often are, when you're breaking away from a concept that's kind of the selling point of the whole thing. But the reason I think the flashbacks work here is mainly, I guess, the way they look from when he's on the golf course, because, number one, in the story, they did like to play up what exactly happened to him, because he kind of kept it from us for a while, and that's what the episode does also, where it's like, it's those moments where he's talking about, oh, when I went into the rough, there was always poison ivy there, and, it'd always be a ... and he'd never quite get to what he was saying after poison ivy was hiding out on the golf course, or off to the side of the golf course. And then when it's finally revealed to be snakes, they get to kind of play with that a little bit in the episode, like the build up to it, by actually showing us him on the golf course before this happened. But also just kind of from a visual standpoint, where like the green of the grass on the golf course looks like really bright, and everything just kind of seems, even though it's like there's a looming thunderstorm happening here, there's still something so vibrant about the golf course scenes compared to the drabness and the bleakness of the autopsy room. And I kind of like the back and forth. It almost kind of looks visually like the difference between life and death when you get to the brightness and then the kind of dreariness, depending on what the settings look like and how they're lit and everything. So in that particular case, I think the flashbacks really work. But then you can also get the sense of, and they also kind of throw in some kind of forced foreshadowing in there, when it's like, when they're on the golf course and the really old doctor's there and they're saying like, oh, I'm gonna drop dead if I keep doing this or whatever, or when they're talking about getting struck by lightning and they say, oh, they're gonna take you away in a Ziploc bag. It's like they're really laying that on thick, but there is just kind of a whole gallows humor surrounding the whole thing, and that's the way it is in the story too. Like that's kind of he talks about that also in that sort of epilogue to the epilogue, where it's that was kind of King's idea, where like, yeah, he knew this concept had been done before, but he wanted to throw almost like this, dark sense of comedy into it, which is something we hadn't really seen in previous ways, because the whole reason he says that authors should tackle this if they're going to, if they write, horror, is that it's a terrifying concept and pretty much universally agreed upon to be that. But to take it in such a different approach, where there's so much of that gallows humor in it, that it does end up making it unique in the long run. And that also is able to carry through, because a lot of the dialogue in the episode is pretty much practically word for word from the story, just like I said, with some changes, especially between the doctors, but one of which, the main doctor being Greta Scacchi. And this is where I think I kind of have the biggest problem, is when you talk about the flashbacks, the addition of this fiancé character. Because the golf course flashbacks, I think, work. The fiancé flashbacks, I think, are a bit overkill and unnecessary, because it feels like the whole thing in general, pretty much the point of it is to give it some sort of sappy, happy ending of sorts. Despite the payoff still somewhat being there. The whole he can't get it up thing, which I think that he can't get it up thing is the episode's thing. In the story, it's just kind of something that happens that doesn't really necessarily have a background like build up before it's some sort of payoff to something. But I kind of love it. Adds to the humor of the whole thing that the epilogue when he talks about it, because it's the doctor that makes that happen, and then he says, "Oh, by the way, after that, me and the doctor were together for 4 months, but I couldn't get it up unless she was wearing the gloves." And that's like that's like the perfect comedic payoff to that whole thing, and it kind of comes from out of nowhere. Also, it's like the very last line. And to kind of take that away immediately and add this other character, there's just something that really takes away from it's even like the big payoff to this story. So I wasn't really too much of a fan of that. But as far as it still having like that sort of playful way about it, I think a lot of that comes into Richard Thomas's narration of it, because at first you think maybe he might sound a little too light in the way he's speaking, given what the circumstance is and how terrified his character is. But then the more it goes on, the more you kind of start to appreciate that, and it takes on like when he's saying his lines in the narration, it kind of reminds me of like when you were in elementary school and you'd have like a guest reader come in and they'd read like a storybook to you and they'd do the voices and all that. He sounds like he's reading the script the way that would happen, the way a reader would read that to like a classroom of kids. And that sounds like it would be a bad thing, but like I said, as it goes on, and it like takes on a more and more playful nature as it goes about everything that's going on, and the way he's reacting to everything, it's pretty perfect, actually. So, I can really get behind that. And then there's the stuff they throw in, the side stuff like Rusty. I mean, Rusty's in the story, but we kind of get a bit more into his sort of selfish douchebaggery and the way that comes in with like how he's trying to like get the dude to sell the golf clubs to him and stuff like that. And he's got his friend who's more concerned about where the golf clubs are than whether or not he's going to live or die or not. Which, of course, is the payoff that we get in the story where the snake is in the golf bag, and that's how they figured it out. Which didn't exactly translate the best to screen, given that this is a very ridiculously animated looking snake. It takes away from pretty much anything the snake does, is how animated and fake and stupid it looks. But apart from that, and that's also like him being stuck in Rusty being stuck in the elevator with the snake, and they kind of try to turn it into like a full-on action scene almost. Feels like we're deviating away from the simplicity of the concept we were talking about at the very beginning that we kind of strayed away from with the flashbacks, but for the most part that was okay. But then by the time we get to this elevator thing going on, I don't know. The elevator action scene obviously worked much better in Battleground than it does here, as did the effects by a huge margin. But yeah, but then you have the whole thing where I love how much credit Rusty gets in the episode for saving the day, pretty much. Where he basically gets this big moment of redemption and gets to be the hero, which is hilarious. And then there was the whole thing about just the dick joke in itself that is basically this whole story. And I was really curious, given that it was, since this is obviously a series for TV, I was curious how that would translate. And of course it's basically camera angles and expressions and like reactions. And they used that pretty well to get those points across. Just like I said, I kind of wish the dick joke had the payoff that it did in the story rather than the episode, which is just downplayed. It's more or less, it's almost played up as like romantic more than funny in the episode, which I don't think that worked. I think that was kind of the whole fiance thing was kind of a dumb call, but you gotta do what you gotta do, I guess. You gotta make it, I guess, theatrical, even though you're making it for TV, but whatever. So yeah, I do think this could have been executed more creatively, and I think the story could have... Like, it's gonna be... Like, if you read the story and then you're like, oh my god, that was translated to the screen in some way, you'll probably be disappointed with how it turns out, but... I'd say if you were just going into it without having read the story, you'd probably get probably a lot more out of it, and the expectations may not have been as high, but going in knowing the story, I think more works than doesn't, but there's some choices I kind of just wish they hadn't made, or some stuff they kind of would have played with just a little more, particularly the first-person perspective, which, like I said, I know that sounds like maybe not the best idea because he's just in one place, but I really think you could have done something with that. But that's pretty much, I think, all you can really say about that. The next one, I think, once again, I want to alternate between TV episode and feature-length movie. So the next one will be a full-on movie, whatever that is, or whichever book it may come from. I'll figure that out eventually. In the meantime, we are going to have a review video. Will be the next one after this one, for sure. And then after that, we'll probably alternate between this and Versus until another review comes along, whenever that is, whatever's going to come out. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.